All right, today we're going to be going over Chapter 4 in Fire in California's Ecosystems. It's all about fire as a physical process. So the main sections that we'll talk about will be the fire triangle, fire behavior, and fire effects. And just like in previous weeks, what I did is I summarized the entire chapter in a short 1-minute concise video that is maybe a little confusing the first time you listen to it. So what we're going to do in this video is break it down line by line, really dive in deep, and just learn more about wildfire together. If you want to stop a wildfire, you need to eliminate one of these three things. Heat, oxygen, and fuel are the three requirements for combustion. Winds supply more oxygen to the fire. Fuel's contribution to combustion depends on size, amount, compactness, and moisture. The heat released by combustion keeps the fire going, but it initially comes from your ignition source, think humans or lightning. As long as these requirements are sufficiently met, your fire will spread through the ground fuels, surface fuels, crown fuels, or perhaps all three. A crown fire is when a surface fire burns up into the canopies and can be either passive or active. Passive is when single trees or groups of trees torch out. Active is when the fire moves from one tree canopy to another and can even be independent from the surface fire below. Depending on the severity, fires can have all kinds of effects on the ecosystem, impacting plants, animals, and soil. In some cases, fires can even alter the weather both during and after the event. Let's take a closer look at that first section, which is all about the fire triangle. It starts out by saying, if you want to stop a wildfire, you need to eliminate one of these three things. Heat, oxygen, and fuel are the three requirements for combustion. Winds supply more oxygen to the fire. Fuel's contribution to combustion depends on size, amount, compactness, and moisture. The heat released by combustion keeps the fire going, but it initially comes from your ignition source. Think humans or lightning. All right, so there's a lot to unpack there. We'll just start off with combustion, and I'll give a little background here. The reason combustion is such a big part of the California ecosystem ties back to the fact that we have a Mediterranean climate. So it's not very, conducive might be the right word, to natural decomposition or the decomposer organisms. So decomposer organisms like when it's warm and humid, think like the tropics, whereas in California, when it's humid enough and there's enough moisture, it's too cold for them to decompose maybe dead trees that have fallen down. And then during summer, it's hot, so they like that, but then it's too dry for them. So what ends up happening is a lot of dead material in California, instead of being naturally decomposed by these organisms, would just sit there if it weren't for combustion. Basically, fires coming through and eliminating all that dead fuel that would otherwise just accumulate. So that's why it is a big part of the California ecosystem. And you can think of combustion as the reverse of the photosynthesis process. So photosynthesis takes CO2 and turns it into oxygen, and then you get your plant structures, whereas combustion is going to require oxygen, and then it tears apart, that might be the right way to say it, the plant structures, and then releases CO2. So right there, I already started to tap into the fire triangle. Oxygen is one of the requirements for combustion. The other two are heat and fuel, and combustion is going to occur in three phases: preheating, gaseous, and smoldering. Preheating, think of that as heat pulling the moisture out of your fuels, getting them ready to burn. Gaseous is when the gases are actually on fire and you see the flames. And then smoldering, that's when the wood itself is burning instead of the gases above the wood. So that's the three phases of combustion. Again, the requirements for that are heat, oxygen, and fuel. So whenever you see firefighters on some wildland fire and they're, building a line, or they're throwing dirt on the fire, or they're pouring water on the fire, what they're doing in each situation is trying to eliminate one of the sides of the fire triangle, whether it's fuel, oxygen, or heat. So now let's get into that a little bit more. Let's just talk about oxygen first. I think that's the simplest one to understand. Basically, the stronger your winds are, the more oxygen is going to be supplied to the fire. Think about if you've ever watched the show Survivor, where when they're trying to start the fire, it's just a little spark, they'll blow on it. Well, they're providing more oxygen, and then that makes the little spark turn into a flame. Another example is if you have a candle and you put the lid on the candle, it goes out because it runs out of oxygen. So we could put that one aside. That's one side of the fire triangle. Another one is heat. Think conduction, radiation, and convection. So conduction, that is heat moving through a solid. So in terms of wildfire, that would be like heat going through a branch, heating up the inside. As it heats up, moisture is going to evaporate, makes it easier for that fire to spread as it becomes drier. The moisture has to evaporate before the combustion can occur. Next, we'll talk about radiation. So that's the heat that's coming off the sides of the fire or around the fire through electromagnetic radiation. It's basically the same mechanism of how the sun heats us up. And that's going to be important on wildfires as well because it will preheat the fuels ahead of the fire. So there's a source and sink aspect to heating on a fire. The source is the fire itself, and then the sink is the fuels ahead of the fire because the moisture has to be evaporated out of them before combustion can occur. So it's going to take some of the heat to preheat those fuels, basically get them to the point where they're ready to combust. And that's why radiation is important, because by the time the fire gets there, if all the moisture's already been evaporated, it can just combust like that. Whereas if you don't have as much heating of those fuels, then when the fire gets there before they can combust, then it has to take some of its energy and the fire kind of loses some of its intensity because it's just trying to get the moisture out of the fuels. And if there's so much moisture in your fuels, the fire won't even spread at all. So that's radiation. Convection is heat going through gases or liquids. So you could think if there's very little wind, most of your convection is going to be going up. Think heat rises, the air above the fire heats up, it becomes less dense, and then it rises. That could be important on wildfires if it's a surface fire below some trees that could heat up the trees, evaporate out their moisture, start a crown fire. But a big part of convection on fires is going to be what your winds are doing, because that's going to take some of that heat that instead of just rising, it's going to be able to push it in front of the blaze and then do something similar to radiation, where it evaporates the moisture out of the fuels. By the time the fire gets there, they're just ready to combust, and then the fire goes a lot faster. So that's the three aspects. Just going over them again, it's conduction, which is through a solid, radiation, think electromagnetic, and then convection, which is through a liquid or a gas. So that's now oxygen and heat. Now the third side of the fire triangle, that's going to be our fuel. And in the short form video, I say it depends on size, amount, compactness, and moisture. So size, this is why you split firewood. So you don't just have a big log and you put it in your fire and you try to light it with a match. You chop it up into different pieces. And I don't want to get too technical here, but what you're doing is increasing the surface area to volume ratio. So basically the surface area over the volume. And the reason that's important is because it's through the surface of that log that it interacts with the environment around it. That's how it heats up. That's how the moisture is evaporated, which is what has to happen before that combustion can occur. So the more surface, the more interaction, the faster it's going to be able to dry out. We can actually just attach some numbers to this. Think if you have a log with, let's just throw out a random number, diameter 6. The equation's a little complicated, but it can be simplified to 4 over the diameter. So that's what I mean by diameter 6. That's going to have a surface area to volume ratio of a 0.67. But if we chop that log into kindling and you now have 7 pieces of diameter 2, our surface area to volume ratio goes from a 0.67 to a 14. So that just means it's going to be able to heat up faster, dry out faster, and then be easier to start that fire. So that now is the size aspect. So tying that into wildfire, that's why grasses dry out a lot faster than maybe whole tree trunks. And you have like 1 hour fuels, 10 hour fuels, 100 hour fuels, 1,000 hour fuels. Just talking about how fast those fuels are going to reach equilibrium with the environment around them. So that equilibrium, basically what I'm meaning there is if you have very dry air, that's drier than your plants, that's going to pull some of the moisture out of your plants. But if you have a lot of moisture come in, then that's actually going to bring some moisture back in your fuels. Your atmosphere and your plants are trying to reach equilibrium. They want the same amount of moisture. And your smaller fuels are going to reach that equilibrium faster because of their surface area to volume ratio. So that can happen on an hourly time scale. whereas some of your larger fuels might not dry out for weeks, or maybe it might take the entire season, where they're moist during winter, they dry out during summer. So that's maybe enough on that one. That can get a little technical there. But that's size. Amount, that one's much simpler, and I won't make this more complicated than it needs to be. If you have more fuel, there's more potential energy there. So you can have much larger fires. Now, the kind of caveat here is that it works both ways. Ties into what I was saying earlier about how your fuel is also a sink of energy, because it requires energy from the fire in order for it to heat up, in order for the moisture to be evaporated. So if you have too much fuel, your fire is actually not going to be able to spread. So there's a little sweet spot there, and it really depends on the other factors as well, especially how dry those fuels are. But before we get to moisture, the other one is compactness. Think about if you chop that log up into your 7 pieces, but then you just put them all back together again, so it was almost like a log. That'd be very compact, and it'd almost just be the same as if you didn't chop them up. Be hard to start that fire. Again, getting back into surface area stuff. But actually, one way to think about this, when you start a fire, you don't put all your kindling in a squished bundle. You build like a little teepee, and then that makes it much easier to start the fire because you're making it less compact. There's more oxygen in there. Now, obviously, there's a sweet spot with this as well, because if your kindling was 2 feet away from each other, then there wouldn't be enough fuel, and it would be actually harder to start the fire. So there's that little sweet spot there as well. And then moisture, not as much of a sweet spot with this one. It's basically the drier your fuels are, the easier it is for the fire to ignite and then spread. And it ties into everything else we've been saying, and it also ties into temperature. The hotter your temperatures are, the faster that moisture is going to evaporate. Same with the more radiation you have, convection, which winds promote your convection. Kind of tying all of that together, but I think we've talked about moisture enough. The one thing we haven't really talked about is ignition. We've talked about that heat from the fire itself, but the heat's originally going to come from some kind of ignition source. So there's a few different ways fires can start, but most of them are going to be humans or lightning. I wish I could tell you, 90% of fires are started by humans, 10% lightning, but it actually just depends on where you are. Pretty intuitive, but if you're in an area where there are more humans, a larger number of fires are going to be started by humans. If it's some remote place in the Sierra that's at some high elevation, then maybe larger percentage of your fires are lightning. And then once your fire starts and you have combustion, then your fire is going to behave in different ways. So let's get into that next. So to recap, the 3 requirements for combustion: heat, oxygen, and fuel. Now, as long as these requirements are sufficiently met, the fire will spread through the ground fuels, surface fuels, crown fuels, or perhaps all 3. A crown fire is when a surface fire burns up into the canopies and can be either passive or active. Passive is when single trees or groups of trees torch out. Active is when the fire moves from one tree canopy to another and can even be independent from the surface fire below. There's 3 kinds of fire discussed here: ground fire, surface fire, crown fire. We'll go through those 3 and then dive into the different types of crown fire. So ground fires first. Think roots burning, or the duff layer, which is like the very dense leaves, twigs, needles. And you're not going to see a whole lot of smoke coming off of this one. It's not flaming. It can even just be smoldering underground for weeks at a time. Can even actually go on for months. I remember with the CZU Lightning Complex up in the Santa Cruz Mountains, it was the next summer, the first really hot, dry day we had all these fires popping up. And it was because the fire had just been smoldering under the surface throughout the entire winter and spring. So then hot, dry day comes and we had all these fires popping up. So that's going to be your ground fire. Think slow smoldering. Surface fire, that one's pretty intuitive. It's on the surface. That's going to be more of like a flaming front. You have your grasses burning, maybe some brush, maybe some small trees. And then your surface fire can turn into a crown fire. This is why having continuous fuels is very important, where it's able to go from your grasses into your brush, into your tree canopies. So types of crown fire are going to be passive, active, and then within active you have independent. Passive, that would be like low wind scenario where, let's say your crown canopy is pretty low to the ground. You have a lot of that heat rising because of convection, something we talked about earlier. It heats up the crown, and then that lights the canopy on fire, and then that tree torches. And maybe it happens to a group of trees, but it's not going from tree to tree. That's going to be your active crown fire, where it maybe still starts from the surface fire, but then once it goes into one tree, then it can go from the canopy of one to another, and then it spreads very rapidly. And that's going to be more likely if you have a dense tree canopy and high winds. And the aspect of it can be independent. It's kind of easy to imagine. Your surface fire is below, your crown fire is up here, and more likely it would be moving together. But if you have very windy conditions, that crown fire can actually just take off by itself and be independent from the fire below. So with crown fires, that's some of your most extreme wildfire behavior. And one thing that we can see on that as well, which ties into fire behavior in general, is spotting. That's where burning embers are picked up, thrown ahead of the major blaze. Maybe it drops in some dry fuels and ignites its own little fire. And that can be very frustrating for firefighters because they spend days putting in a bunch of good lines, and then winds pick up burning embers, toss them over the lines, and then the fire takes off. That's something we saw on the Dixie fire. Now, this is something I learned in this textbook that I never really thought about, but it makes perfect sense. Your larger embers aren't going to be able to be tossed as far, whereas your lighter ones are going to go very far. But it's also the larger ones that are going to start more fires, because since they're not tossed as far, it's more likely that they're still burning when they touch the ground. So never really thought about that. Thought that was kind of cool. That ties in your three kinds of fires: ground, surface, crown. Now let's look at some of the effects that we can get from fires. Depending on the severity, fires can have all kinds of effects on the ecosystem, impacting plants, animals, and soil. In some cases, fires can even alter the weather, both during and after the event. So I'm glad I read this section in the textbook because it actually provides a much more nuanced picture of fire severity than I originally had. For example, you could have a high intensity fire over a short duration that has similar severity to a low intensity fire of very long duration. Or you could have a high intensity crown fire that maybe leads to a large mortality within your trees, basically it destroys the trees, but your soil is totally fine. Or you could have a low intensity fire that's creeping along the soil that maybe leaves the trees unharmed, but then the soil is completely scorched. So you can have varying impacts there. Then you can also have varying impacts with animals and plants, and it's actually not always negative. You also can have some positives from wildfire. It's a natural part of the California ecosystem. We'll just look at the plant aspect. So obviously negative of plants is if a fire just comes through, destroys everything. A positive is a lot of the plants in California have adapted to wildfire because we have a Mediterranean climate. Fire is just a natural part of our ecosystem. So a lot of the plants here not only have adapted to fire, but actually require it. It's part of their reproductive cycle. For example, chamise will drop a bunch of seeds. Chamise is a plant that's in the chaparral. And then those seeds actually wait for a fire to come through, clear out the competition before those seeds will germinate, because now they're in an environment where they have abundant sunshine, more water to themselves, maybe some fresh nutrients from the ash, and it can actually help the chamise plant that a fire came through. So not always negative, can also be positive. I also mentioned towards the end of the short form video that the wildfire can alter the weather both during and after the event. During the event, it ties into what we were talking about with heat earlier, where you get a lot of rising air on a fire because the fire heats up the air above the fire, becomes less dense, that rises. But then you're going to have air rushing in to take the place of that, so that's going to impact your winds and sometimes lead to erratic fire behavior, spread the fire faster. So fire could increase your winds. It could also, in some cases, actually decrease your temperatures. That might not seem intuitive at first, but I've seen this on a number of fires where they produce so much smoke that it basically blocks out the sun. And then as long as your winds don't push that smoke out, it can actually lead to lower temperatures the next day. Because you have lower temperatures, there's going to be more moisture in the air, and can almost provide a negative feedback loop on the fire where so much smoke was produced the day before that you have decreased fire activity the next day because your weather has been impacted by all of that smoke, lower temperatures, more moisture in the air. So That's impacting weather during the event. It can also impact weather after the event. Something I never really thought about, but makes perfect sense. If a fire clears out a bunch of trees and those trees were providing shading to an area, well, now maybe your grasses, which used to be shaded, are now going to be in complete sunlight, so your temperatures are going to be higher, your relative humidity is going to be lower, and then now fire is more likely in that area because of a fire that came through. Now, with that being said, it also would have cleared out some fuels, so you have some varying aspects there as well. That's why I love reading this textbook. It just provides a lot more nuance. It takes some of the simple ideas that I had and just tears those to pieces, or at least provides a lot more context to them. So I'm looking forward to continuing to read this textbook. I'll try to continue to share what I learn with you as well as I can, and thanks for watching.